Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's special program brought to you by the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. My name is Alex Ames, and I serve as Director of Outreach and Engagement at the Rosenbach and as one of the facilitators of the Ladies of the House of Love, the Rosenbach's Feminist and Queer Gothic Literature Book Club. Those of you who are already familiar with the Rosenbach know that we are a center for the study and enjoyment of Gothic literature, especially vampire literature, including Bram Stoker's Dracula and the many approaches to vampire lore that connect to this classic work. We're especially interested in thinking about the different cultural and political manifestations of vampirism, and as it were, in our book club meeting at the Rosenbach this coming week, we are reading Jewelle Gomez's The Gilda Stories, the first Black vampire novel published in the United States, and one area of focus for the scholarship of our distinguished guest today, Professor Jerry Rafiki Jenkins. I'm so excited to learn more about his work, especially as it connects to Gomez's book and other examples of Black American vampire literature. Let me tell you more about our guest. Dr. Jenkins is professor of English at Palomar College in San Marcos, California, whose research focuses on Black speculative fiction and film. His peer-reviewed articles appear in Screening Noir, African American Review, the Journal of Children's Literature, and Pacific Coast Philology, and he is the author of The Paradox of Blackness in African American Vampire Fiction. Professor Jenkins also co-edited with Martin Yaptok, Authentic Blackness, Real Blackness, Essays on the Meaning of Blackness in Literature and Culture, and Human Contradictions in Octavia E. Butler's work. Professor, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today virtually here at the Rosenbach for this conversation. This program will last approximately 1 hour. We'll start off with about 30 minutes of lecture by Professor Jenkins, and then make ourselves available for questions after the fact. And I'll keep my eye on the chat for that purpose. Professor Jenkins, thanks again, and please take it away.
Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate that introduction. And I hope that my presentation today will be worthy of such good words. I would like to also thank everybody who will have the time to participate and enjoy this lecture. And I'm excited that people are interested in Black American vampire literature. In fact, when I got the invitation from Alex to speak to you all, I was extremely excited because I was getting a chance to be a nerd with people who are interested in thinking about humanity's fascination with the vampire, a figure who, according to Christopher Fledgling, is as old as the world. I was also excited because I got a chance to talk about a novel that is important to the study of African American vampire literature, Black American literature as well as vampire literature, and it continues to influence my research on Black speculative culture. That novel, as you might have guessed, is Jewelle Gomez's The Gilda Stories. And as Alex pointed out, it's the first vampire novel with a Black protagonist written by an African American author. However, before discussing Gomez's novel, I would like to provide a brief overview of the historical and theoretical context of my examination of Black American vampire fiction, And then hopefully that will provide some context to understand my engagement with Gomez's novel. One point that I address at the beginning of my study is the problem of limiting the vampire's literary and historical roots to the medieval and 19th century Europe. Such limitations, I argue, overlook the widespread presence of vampires throughout the ancient world, a presence that indicates that the fears and desires that these creatures stir up are deeply rooted in the human psyche, and therefore in the African psyche. This means that although Black American vampire fiction is a late 20th century development, vampire myths are not foreign to Africa or the African diaspora. For example, the Yoruba of pre-colonial Nigeria referred to their vampires as witch wives, jealous women who, quote unquote, secretly sucked the blood of their husbands and of their children of their other wives. And the vampires of the Hausa tribe in Niger were referred to as soul-stealing witches. The Obayifo and the Asasabansum were West African witches who attacked at night, sucked the blood of their victims, most often children, and were members of the community who lived incognito. The As, found in Ghana and Togo, could assume the form of a firefly, and it sat on the mouth of its victims while using a sucking apparatus that resembled an elephant's trunk. Moreover, many of these African vampires would make their way to the Caribbean via the slave trade and would become, for example, the Lugaru of Haiti and Grenada, the Sema of Suriname, and the Sukayan or the Sukayan of Trinidad and Guyana. In Europe, the 1851 play Le Vampire, made by Alexandre Dumas, the grandson of a Haitian slave and a French aristocrat, is considered the first Black writer in the West to pen a version of the vampire myth, and for some, the father of Black horror. What makes Dumas's play a noteworthy text in the European vampire literary tradition is that it has the first dark-skinned character to appear in a vampire story, a woman he describes as Moorish and cast in the role of a pagan witch. It appears that Sheridan Le Fanu followed Dumas's lead, as evidenced in his 1872 Carmilla, where we find a, quote, hideous Black woman who wears a sort of colored turban and has gleaming eyes, large white eyeballs, and teeth set as if in fury, unquote. In the US, there are a few reports of vampires by Black Americans living in the South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For instance, there is an account from Tennessee of an old woman who sucked the blood of sleeping children to improve her health. In Louisiana, the fifole or the fufole, a derivative of the French incubus, was the soul of a dead person or a child who died before baptism. This soul was returned to earth by God to do penance. However, instead of doing penance, the fifole attacked people and, like its Caribbean West African ancestors, occasionally became a vampire who sucked the blood of people, especially children. What the vampire myths of Africa and an African diaspora demonstrate is that the vampire has a history that predates the word vampire, the biological notion of race, and even Bram Stoker's Dracula. Therefore, to use Dracula as a starting and ending points on what constitutes a vampire is to racialize vampire mythology as white. Indeed, given the vampire's history, I believe we should think of the vampire as a figure that expresses how a culture confronts humanity's deeply rooted fears and desires at a particular historical moment. I propose that many of these deeply rooted fears and desires can be reduced to one fear and one desire, the fear of death and the desire for immortality. I think Mary Haleb captures this point best in her 2009 study, Vampire God, the Allure of the Undead in Western Culture. Quote, the vampire's most human quality, its infinite adaptability to people, place, and time, is a major reason for its persistence. This, along with its very unhuman and ambiguous position between the flesh and the spirit, its mysterious comings and goings, and its variable forms and faces, allows it to be continually revived in different guises in our differing worlds. But as diverse as they may be, from the bloated present of folklore to the opera Cape Dracula to the bratty Lost Boys, vampires address issues and attitudes about death and immortality that are meaningful in all times and places, unquote. My approach to examining immortality in Black American fiction draws upon Stephen Cave's discussion of how the human quest for immortality drives our civilization. To understand that quest, according to Cave, we must begin with what he refers to as the mortality paradox. The theory that death for humans is both inevitable and impossible. Quote, on the one hand, our powerful intellects come inexorably to the conclusion that we, like all other living things around us, must one day die. Yet, on the other, the one thing these minds cannot imagine is that very state of non-existence. It is literally inconceivable, unquote. To solve this paradox, we have, Cave argues, created 4 immortality narratives that account for every human attempt at achieving everlasting life. The staying alive narrative, the resurrection narrative, the soul narrative, and the legacy narrative. Although Cave concludes that these narratives are illusions that will not enable us to live forever, they are important because they shape our everyday lives by driving our societies. For instance, the first and most straightforward immortality narrative is the staying alive narrative, the dream of avoiding death forever. That dream, according to Cave, has sustained whole religions and shaped the ideal of scientific progress. What is perhaps most noteworthy about the staying alive narrative is that it's not concerned with life after death questions. Instead, this narrative is concerned with staying alive here and now. That is, it is concerned with acquiring a steady flow of the basics of survival, such as food, drink, shelter, and defenses. Since civilizations are, at their core, a collection of life extension technologies that refine the ways in which we acquire the basics of survival, they also represent our first attempts to stay alive forever. Unlike the staying alive narrative, which disputes the notion that all living things must die, the resurrection narrative accepts the fact that death is inevitable. However, this narrative's followers also proclaim that one day, with the self-same bodies, we can rise to live again. Central to this narrative's appeal is the belief that it is possible to undo the processes of death and decay by magically binding the linearity of human fates to the cycles of nature that promise life, death, and life again. The third immortality narrative, which is the backup plan for the first 2, is the soul narrative, the belief that the real you is separate from your body and can outlive it. This narrative not only makes the body irrelevant in the quest for immortality, but it also provides an authentic transhistorical self that belongs to the unchanging realm of the divine. Finally, the legacy narrative contends that we can become immortal in our offspring or in the world of the symbolic, that is, the world of language and culture. Unlike the previous immortality narratives, the legacy narrative is the only one that is bodiless and soulless, the only one that does not require individuals to have a body or soul to live on indefinitely. Considering Cave's immortality narrative, Stoker's iconic vampire is an example of the resurrection narrative. However, as noted by J. Gordon Melton in the Vampire book, The Encyclopedia of the Undead, while the typical dictionary definition of the vampire, the definition that describes Stoker Dracula, depicts the creature as a reanimated corpse that arises from the grave to suck the blood of living people to retain a semblance of life, that definition is inadequate because it does not describe all vampires. Melton's comments help to explain another reason why Dracula is a problematic starting point for my study of Black American vampire novels. Only one of the Black vampires that I examine is a resurrection vampire. The rest are staying alive vampires, vampires who do not need to die to achieve immortality. Thus, one of the goals of my book is to demonstrate that the variety of Black vampires in Black American vampire fiction implies that these vampires offer not only several ways to grapple with the mortality paradox, but also several ways to be Black. For example, on the one hand, the Black vampires discussed in my study have a broader, more ancient cultural frame of reference than Dracula and the vampires of European tradition. Indeed, none of these Black vampires trace their lineage to Stoker's Dracula or to medieval Eastern European folklore. In fact, when Dracula is mentioned in these texts, he tends to be treated as a mythical caricature of the vampire. On the other hand, These Black literary vampires are not modern versions of the vampire witches of West African and Black Caribbean folklore, though some of them are from Africa. Instead, they can be read as instead, they can be read as a corrective to the new vampire that emerged in the US during the 1970s. When Blackula, the 1972 movie that became the first Hollywood-produced film about a Black vampire, initiated America's departure from the vampirism of Stoker's Dracula. Hollywood was so impressed with Blackula's box office success that American International Pictures, the studio that released Blackula, announced its plan to remake all classical Hollywood horror films with all Black casts. However, Blackula not only engendered the Blaxploitation horror genre, but it also helped shape the cinematic adaptations of Stoker's novel by John Badham and Francis Ford Coppola in 1979 and 1992, respectively, by making the vampire more human than monster. Moreover, Blackula's box office success led to the production of Bill Gunn's Ganja and Hess, the 1973 Black vampire film whose philosophical musings would become the cornerstone of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. Blackula may have also inspired the creation of the 1970s Marvel Comics character Blade, a half-human, half-vampire Black warrior hero who has been immortalized by Wesley Snipes in the Blade film trilogy. The Black vampires in Blackula and Ganja Hess represent, in part, what Jules Zanger refers to as the new vampire. Unlike the old vampire, such as Dracula, the new vampire is secularized, socialized, and humanized. The new vampire, whom Zanger identifies as a white American ethnic who is a victim of heredity or a viral infection, is not a damned soul living solitary life as one of the devil's minions. Instead, this vampire belongs to a community of vampires who are more human than monster in that they have free will. This means that the new vampire has the choice to be good or evil, a choice that is unavailable to Dracula. Although the Black literary vampires examined in my study, like their white ethnic counterparts, are more human than monster in that they are communal and have free will, these vampires, unlike their counterparts, tend to belong to a multiracial or a Black multicultural vampire community. Indeed, while Blackula and Ganja and Hess represent the cinematic versions of the Black new vampire, the Gilda stories represents the literary version of that vampire. Published in 1991, the Gilda story begins in 1850 with Gilda as an unnamed Black girl who has recently escaped slavery and ends with her as a Black vampire who achieves real freedom in 2050. During her escape from the Mississippi plantation where she was born, her father was sold, and her mother died, Gilda kills a white man wearing the clothes of an overseer who was stiff for conquest. Hiding in the cellar of a farmhouse in Louisiana, Gilda is discovered and taken in by Miss Gilda, a white female vampire who owns a brothel near New Orleans. Eventually, Miss Gilda and Bird, a Native American woman who is Miss Gilda's partner, give Gilda the gift of vampirism, a gift that will allow her to travel across the US in search of the moment when she is no longer fleeing for her life, the moment when she is truly free. However, Gilda realizes very early in her life as a vampire that her search for freedom is not an individual journey, but a communal one. Therefore, she builds a family of vampires that consists of 3 Black lesbians, including herself, a straight Black man, 2 gay white men, and a Native American lesbian. In spite of being free from slavery for over 40 years, Gilda tells one of her future vampire family members that killing the overseer or the end of slavery did not make her feel free. Quote, "It soon became clear that although the institution of enslavement was no longer sanctioned, our world had not become a more hospitable place for me or my people. Often it was only the gift that I acquired in this new life as a vampire that saved me from those we called civilized, unquote. As suggested by the passage above, one of the first lessons that Gilda learns as a free woman and as a vampire is that freedom, as well as oppression, cannot be achieved or maintained without violence or the threat of it. Indeed, Gilda's gift has saved her from being lynched, raped, beaten, and exploited by the so-called civilized of Reconstruction, right? The barbarians of white supremacy. Although Gilda killed the bounty hunter as a human, implying that she was destined to be free long before she became a vampire, she admits that she would not have maintained her freedom if it were not for her vampirism. In this way, the novel suggests that the novel signifies, if you will, on contemporary vampire culture by inverting the vampire from a trope connotated with death to a positive, life-affirming figure. Gomez's desire to invert the trope began when she was a teenager. Gomez's desire to invert the vampire trope began when she was a teenager. In the afterword to the 2004 edition of the Gilda Stories, Gomez states that her fascination with Dracula started at 15 years old, when she began watching classic horror movies with her neighborhood friends. She recognized later in life that her attraction to the legendary vampire was due to the link she made between the loneliness she felt as a child of divorced parents and Dracula's doomed pursuit of a companion who would live with him forever. Although Gomez was never quite comfortable with the dead bodies that littered Dracula's path to fulfillment, she believed during her adolescent years that she was the only one who could understand Dracula's suffering. As a lesbian feminist of mixed race, however, Gomez states that she needed to quote unquote excavate and reshape the mythology of the vampire before she could claim vampires as her own. In other words, to claim vampires as her own, Gomez had to create a vampire with a cultural frame of reference that is older and more diverse than Dracula's. To do so, Gomez's vampire had to be a heroic figure who embodied and interrogated the activism reflected in, for example, the poems of the Black Arts Movement, the songs of the feminist movement, and the literary journals of lesbian activists. What made these poems, songs, and journals produced during the highly active political period of the 1970s and 80s what made these poems, songs, and journals produced during a highly active political period of the 1970s and 80s inspirational for Gomez is that in the process of converting the pain of oppression into art, they also became calls to action, calls that shape her vampire's actions, observations, and personal development. While Gomez acknowledges that Black vampire films of the 1970s, such as Dracula and Gothic and Hess, attempted to claim the vampire myth for African Americans, she also notes that these films rely on a formulaic design in which the Black woman functions as either handmaiden or as temptress and bait. Thus, Gomez needed to de-whiten, de-straighten, de-male, and de-pain the vampire myth to claim vampires as her own, and to give long literary and political significance to the lives of Black lesbians. Gilda not only satisfies Gomez's need to recast the vampire as a Black lesbian who is not doomed to loneliness, but she also offers a queer critique of the single-issue view of Black freedom, a view that informed two movements that competed for the hearts and minds of Black Americans during the 1970s and 80s, Afrocentrism and multicultural conservatism. A queer critique, as defined in my study, is an anti-normative project that challenges identity and genre categories that are presented as authentic or as transcending time, space, and culture. Consequently, a queer critique of the single issue of Black freedom, the ideal that the only ism that negatively affects the Black American community is racism, and that straight Black men are racism's primary victims, is concerned with interrogating not only normalization of heterosexuality in this view of Black freedom, but also the normalization of the straight Black male as the image of Black freedom. Indeed, what makes Afrocentrism and multicultural conservatism problematic is that they foster notions of Blackness and freedom in which Black lesbians are constructed as those who are not really Black, and therefore should never be viewed as representatives of Black freedom. An alternative to the conceptions of Black freedom offered by Afrocentrism and multicultural conservatism, Gilda calls for a full vision of Black freedom. For Gilda, to move toward a vision of Black freedom, Black Americans must adopt the expression, a row of cotton is a row of cotton. This expression proposes that all Black bodies, regardless of how they are identified, are the same in the eyes of those who seek to produce and consume Black bodies in pain. For instance, when Gilda kills the white overseer who is trying to rape her and return her to slavery, and the Black pimp who is terrorizing and exploiting Black women, Gomez is showing that Black sexism is just as dangerous as white racism. Both isms produce Black bodies in pain. At the same time, Gilda's full vision of Black freedom is not just for Black people. As she recalls the problems of the freedom movement since the 1960s, quote, most of the men we marched with ran out of liberation ideals. They had a big dream about Black men being free, but that's as far as it went. They really didn't have a full vision, women being free, Puerto Ricans being free, homosexuals being free. So things kind of folded in on top of themselves, unquote. Thus, the expression, a row of cotton is a row of cotton, offers a vision of Black freedom that includes all who are socially, economically, politically, and legally marginalized due to their racial, gender, and/or sexual identities. In this way, Black freedom in the Gilda stories can be read as a synonym for human freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that commentary. I feel much better prepared to engage in our book club discussion about the stories this coming weeks. It's just really fascinating context for that particular novel. And I see that we have a couple questions, which I will read to you to consider. The first is, for those of us interested in exploring Black American vampire literature, where do you recommend we start? Presumably, in addition to the Gilda stories, what are some books that would be good entry points into this genre for newcomers?
Sure. I want to begin, I guess I could try to see if I could do this in some type of chronological order. But after the Gilda stories, I would suggest trying Jemiah Jefferson's book, The Voice of the Blood, and this is part of her vampire series, the Vampire Quartet. And so she's a Black American writer who actually looks at the politics of being mixed in relationship to vampirism. So I think that's pretty interesting. We also have, which I think is considered the first short story collection of Black vampire stories, and that is Dark Thirst. And this collection, I think, is really, really excellent. Probably one of my favorite stories is titled The Ultimate Diet, and it's a really smart take on vampire in relationship to kind of like body imagery and kind of this obsession with dieting, right? So I think it's pretty fascinating way in which she engages, the author does. This novel, Dark Corner by Brandon Massey. He's a very known Black horror writer, and he's written tons of novels. I think he has definitely close to maybe 10, 12 novels out. But this is his first vampire novel. And it's an interesting tale because it looks at this engagement of kind of African and African-American relationships. And it really poses a question, can the notion of Blackness in America be something that is absent of Africanness, if that makes sense? The next text I would suggest is definitely Octavia Butler's Fledgling. Unfortunately, I do not have a plat for it, but that's her novel, I think, is just so fantastic because it deals with so many issues, particularly the ideal that I guess you can call it transhumanism, and this ideal of using technology to basically improve the human, if you will. And she engages that question by looking at a vampire who is a product of biological engineering, right? And part of the reason why she was created is that for her people to gain the ability to exist in sunlight. So it's a fascinating tale about questions of identity and about race and the role that, as Butler puts it, the role that melanin plays in uniting us as humans. Right, so I think Butler's Fledgling is a good text to look at. Image of Emeralds and Chocolate is considered the first Black gay male vampire novel. And this novel really brings in a nice way of kind of historicizing Black queerness within African American culture, and particularly in this instance, the Black vampire has its history in slavery. So it becomes this very interesting dynamic of this Black vampire who's enslaved, but eventually becomes part of like these freedom movements and practices of Black advancement. So it's a really fascinating tale, and again, a kind of this historization of Black queer identity. And another, although this is not a novel, another book that may be of interest with respect to kind of an analysis of Black vampire novels is by Kendra Parker, and it's Black female vampires in African American novels, 1977 and 2011. So she looks at not only the Gilda stories, but and as well as Butler's Fledgling, but she also looks at Pearl Cleage's Just Want to Testify, which is a novel I didn't know about until I read her book. So there's a couple of texts in there that she engages that may be also of interest in a good way to kind of enter into Black American vampire literature.
Thanks for all those suggestions, and it's just remarkable to see how rich this genre has become, sort of following Gomez's classic work. So thanks for sharing all of those. It looks like we have one more question, which I will read to you. How do LGBTQIA authors explore vampirism's obvious reliance on blood exchange in the context of HIV/AIDS? Have queer vampire stories evolved in their treatment of the subject over the past several decades?
And it's interesting because I think that's actually a good question, because I think about it in the context of Black American vampire literature. And one of the things that seems to happen is that with respect to blood and blood exchange, I think what becomes interesting is that it's really tied to questions of race, or it has become more tied to questions of race, right? As opposed to dealing with questions with HIV or AIDS. And I think part of that, and I could be wrong, but I think part of that kind of shift, if you will, is about the way in which I think that vampirism is come to be seen more as, which I think Gomez does in her novel, to be seen more as a gift, right? So in this way, it functions as a way of kind of healing, right? And I think that becomes important, right? Because I think what we see, for example, in Butler's Fledgling, right, is that the venom, if you will, of the vampires is tied to questions of not only race, but also questions of healing, right? And so in this instance, the way in which I see the novel taking place or operating is that one, sexuality is not an issue with the vampire people, and thus disease itself, HIV or other diseases, would be seen as something that is not a curse, right? Or like a punishment, right? And so it's something that's to be cured. So I think in that instance that it becomes interesting in thinking about, at least within the context of Butler's novel, how this ideal about the exchange of blood and how it relates to HIV and AIDS is interesting, because she really doesn't necessarily tap into it, but looks at disease as a whole and how this vampiric blood can be a cure for all that. Whereas Butler's writing in 2005, Johnson's novel that comes out in 2012 does have a vampiric character who once had HIV, but is cured through vampirism as well, right? And so what ends up happening again is this narrative that vampirism becomes this gift that is able to cure this illness, right? And so that, at least the way I'm reading these texts, right, that this illness does not become a definition of queer folks, right? And that becomes important because it's seen simply as an illness and not as something that only this group of people get.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that insight. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Professor, for your time today and helping us at the Rosenbach contextualize our Dracula notes, our manuscript notes within this wider context. I think it's so important to think about the global context of the origins of this legend, of this trope, and how it's being applied by authors doing really interesting work in the United States. So thank you very much for your time. And I really look forward both to continuing to engage with your own scholarship and to follow up on all those book suggestions that you made. So much appreciated. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for your time and interest in this subject. I will share that the Rosenbach has just released its roster of winter 2024 programs, and registration for members begins on December 14th, with registration for the general public opening on January 3rd. Please check out rosenbach.org/events to see what we have happening. And I hope that you'll consider making a small donation to the institution so that we can keep offering free digital programs like today's presentation. Thank you all so very much. Again, thank you to our guest for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you at the Rosenbach very soon.